Imagine, just for a second, that you're driving your family sedan down a really dark, muddy, two-lane road.
Sounds like the start of a horror movie.
Right, like it's East Texas, it's a damp night, you're just trying to get home after grabbing a bite to eat. You round this curve, the headlights sweep through the dense pine trees, and suddenly you just run headfirst into what looks like an industrial-scale aerospace disaster.
Which is terrifying.
Exactly. Hovering right over the asphalt is this metallic diamond, and we're talking the size of a municipal water tower. Blindingly bright, it is periodically spewing this atomic-looking fire out of its base, just cooking the air.
Yeah, the thermal output they described was incredible.
Sending waves of heat so intense that the vinyl dashboard inside your car physically begins to melt, and as you're sitting there, totally paralyzed, the sky above you begins to vibrate.
Because of the helicopters.
Yes. You realize this floating inferno is being completely surrounded by 23 massive twin-rotor military helicopters.
I mean, it sounds exactly like the inciting incident of a science fiction novel, doesn't it? A highly produced cinematic set piece.
It really does. But as this terrifying, just absolutely massive stack of medical records, military flight logs, and classified Pentagon documents sitting in front of us proves, well, it was entirely lethally real.
And that reality is what makes the December 1980 Cash Landrum incident a permanent, jagged edge in the history of aerospace anomalies.
Welcome, everyone, and especially a massive welcome to you, the listener who actually requested this journey. You, the learner, have handed us an incredibly dense, challenging, and frankly horrifying stack of source material today.
It's a phenomenal collection. I mean, dark, definitely, but phenomenal.
Oh, absolutely. You brought us Defense Intelligence Reference documents, DRD's House Oversight Committee testimonies, investigative reporting.
And what stands out immediately with this stack of sources is how this specific case forces us to cross-reference disciplines that, honestly, traditionally never speak to one another.
Right, like they're in totally different silos.
Exactly. To understand this, we have to synthesize military logistics, biophysics, aviation law, and emergency room diagnostics.
Yeah, so here's our mission statement for today's deep dive. We are conducting a comprehensive technical investigation into the Cash Landrum incident. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
Because if you, the learner, are familiar with the typical UFO narrative, you know the standard drill, right? Usually it's blurry photograph.
Or a light in the sky seen by a lone hiker.
Exactly, or a fuzzy radar return that vanishes into the ether. There is almost always a profound, frustrating lack of physical evidence. But this case completely shatters that mold.
It really does. We are not dealing with a transient light in the sky. The Cash Landrum incident left a permanent, horrifying record of biological damage and the thermal alteration of physical materials, plus a massive logistical footprint.
Which you just can't fake.
Right. Our goal today is to impartially sift through all of this raw data. We need to separate the forensic evidence from the folklore and try to understand exactly why this specific anomaly fundamentally broke the standard narrative of unexplained aerial phenomena.
We have to look at the hard data, no matter how uncomfortable the implications might be. And to do that properly, to really ground this mountain of paperwork, we have to start with the human element.
Absolutely.
Before we get into the high-tech anomalies, the military hardware, or the whole labyrinth of legal battles, we need to understand who this happened to and what they experienced minute by minute. We need to go back to the mud in Texas.
The setting is crucial here. It provides the environmental baseline. You have to understand the ordinary in order to measure the sheer scale of the anomalous data that follows.
Right. So put yourself in this scene. It is December 29th, 1980. We are in the dense, damp, piney woods of East Texas. Specifically, this isolated tree-lined stretch of a two-lane road known as Farm to Market Road 1485, or FM 1485.
And the weather is a factor too.
Yeah, it has been raining on and off, so the dirt shoulders on the side of the road are soft, saturated, and muddy. It's around 9:00 p.m.
And driving down this dark, secluded road are three individuals who, it should be noted, had absolutely no prior interest in the paranormal or ufology or the black-budget aerospace industry.
Just regular people.
Right. We have Betty Cash, who is 51 years old. She's a local business owner. She runs a diner. We have her friend and employee, Vicki Landrum, who is 57. And riding in the back seat is Vicki's 7-year-old grandson, Colby Landrum.
Just a completely normal, mundane Monday night. They'd actually planned to go to their local bingo hall, but when they arrived, they found it closed for the holidays.
Which is such a mundane detail, but it places them on that road.
Exactly. So, pivoting, they drove to a truck stop in the nearby town of New Caney for dinner. They finished their meals, hopped back into Betty's pristine two-door Oldsmobile Cutlass, and head southbound, making their way back home to Dayton, Texas.
It is the definition of an ordinary evening. And that ordinariness is what makes the sudden intrusion of the event so jarring. As they're driving, cruising through this tunnel of pine trees, Colby, from the back seat, is the first to notice something. He points out a brilliant light shining through the dense tree line ahead of them.
Now, initially, they try to rationalize it, right? Because that's what the human brain does when confronted with something weird. They are roughly 35 miles away from Houston Intercontinental Airport.
So Vicky looks at the glow and assumes it's just a large commercial airliner coming in unusually low for a landing.
Yeah, or maybe a spotlight from a normal helicopter. But as Betty navigates a curve in FM 1485, that rationalization instantly evaporates.
Because what they see hovering directly over the roadway is definitively not a Boeing 747. It is a massive, intensely glowing metallic craft.
And the physical description they provide in the police reports and the subsequent investigations is incredibly specific. This isn't your classic 1950s flying saucer.
No, the geometry is very strange.
Freddie Cash described it as a huge, upright diamond shape. But the top and bottom points of the diamond were blunt, like they were cut off, making them flat.
Right, a truncated diamond.
Yeah. Around the center perimeter, it was ringed with small blue lights. And the scale of this thing, we're not talking about a little drone here, they estimated it was roughly the size of the Dayton Municipal Water Tower.
Which means we're talking about an artificial structure of immense mass and volume hovering just above tree level. The structural engineering required just to keep an object of that size airborne without wings or visible rotors is staggering.
It defies standard aerodynamics.
Exactly. But the visual geometry is only one component of the sensory overload they are experiencing. We have to look at the energy output.
And this is where it gets terrifying. The craft wasn't just silently, gracefully floating, it seemed to be in distress. Periodically, over the next few minutes, it expelled massive cones of roaring flames straight downward from its flat bottom.
Like an active thruster.
Right. The craft would sink down slightly toward the road, almost as if losing lift, and then these immense flames would blast out with a deafening roar, pushing the gigantic structure back up into the air.
It is exhibiting the flight characteristics of a vehicle struggling to maintain altitude. The expulsion of thrust is sporadic, not continuous.
Right, it's sputtering.
Yeah, which strongly implies a mechanical failure. Or perhaps an emergency protocol overriding the standard propulsion system to prevent a catastrophic crash.
And the heat, the sheer thermal intensity radiating from this thing, is almost beyond comprehension. Betty slams on the brakes and stops the Oldsmobile about 130 feet away from it.
Which is dangerously close.
Too close. But the road is too narrow to pull a U-turn in a boat of a car like a Cutlass. And she knows if she pulls onto the wet, muddy shoulder, the heavy car will immediately sink and get stuck.
So she's trapped.
Yeah. So she actually gets out of the car, stepping onto the asphalt to see what exactly is blocking their path and if there's any way around it.
Which exposes her directly, without the barrier of the windshield or the car roof, to the unshielded environmental effects of the craft.
A terrible mistake in hindsight.
Vicky, meanwhile, stays inside the car. Her primary focus is protecting and comforting young Colby, who is absolutely terrified. He is screaming, cowering in the floorboard of the back seat.
Right. And Vicky, who is a deeply religious woman, truly believes she is witnessing the biblical end of the world. She is trying to calm her grandson by telling him, Colby, don't be afraid. If you see a man, it'll be Jesus. He's come to carry us to a better place.
Wow.
That is the level of existential terror happening inside that vehicle. They are quite literally preparing to die.
While outside, the thermal radiation is beginning to physically alter their environment. The metal body of the Oldsmobile is absorbing so much radiant heat that it becomes painful to the touch.
I want to focus on this for a second because this is where the physics of the event leave a permanent fingerprint. When Betty realizes the immense danger they are in and decides she needs to get back into the car, the metal door handle is so blistering hot that she literally cannot touch it with her bare skin.
She'd burn her hand.
Exactly. She has to wrap her thick leather winter coat around her hand just to wrench the door open. And inside the car, the ambient temperature has spiked so drastically that Vicky leans forward to steady herself against the dashboard, and her hand presses directly into the vinyl.
And this is a critical detail in the case.
The heat had actually softened the synthetic material of the dash. When Vicky pushed her hand into it, she allegedly left a permanent handprint pressed into the vinyl.
That's incredible.
We aren't just talking about a hot summer day in a parking lot. We are talking about a thermal radiation intense enough to break down the molecular structure of synthetic polymers in a matter of minutes.
That detail moves the event from a visual hallucination or a psychological misinterpretation into a physical thermal event. Hallucinations do not alter polymers.
Right. You can't imagine a melted dashboard.
But the encounter isn't over. Because as this massive flat-top diamond is roaring and struggling upward, spewing literal fire onto the highway, the sky suddenly fills with a deafening, rhythmic thumping sound.
Right. The witnesses look up and realize the craft is not alone. As the fire illuminates the sky, they report a massive arrival of military helicopters. Specifically, they count 23 heavy-lift choppers.
And these weren't just vague silhouettes against the clouds. Because of the intense light from the diamond craft and the helicopter's own sweeping searchlights, the witnesses could clearly identify the airframes.
They knew exactly what they were looking at.
They did. They were twin-rotor Boeing CH-47 Chinooks. 23 of them, flying in a tight, highly coordinated diamond formation, completely surrounding the struggling craft.
Okay, let's pause and think about the logistics of that. You don't just misplace 23 heavy-lift Chinooks. That's not a set of car keys.
Not at all.
A Chinook is a 99-foot-long, 24,000-pound beast of a machine. The rotor wash from just one of them is enough to knock you over. The decibel level of 23 of them flying at low altitude, it would shake your teeth loose in your skull.
A deployment of 23 CH-47 Chinooks is an incredibly large, highly complex aviation operation. These are heavy transport helicopters utilized primarily by the U.S. Army. For 23 of them to be operating in tight formation, at low altitude, at night, requires immense logistical coordination. It requires dozens of pilots, navigators, air traffic control tracking, and thousands of gallons of aviation fuel.
And it wasn't just Betty, Vicky, and Colby who saw them. If it were just them, skeptics could argue it was a localized delusion. But we have secondary corroboration.
The police officer.
Yes. A Dayton police officer named Lamar Walker and his wife were driving nearby that same night. They reported seeing a massive formation of about 12 Chinook-type helicopters flying through that exact area at that exact time.
And trained observers are crucial here.
Absolutely. Walker noted they were flying at about 500 feet in groups of 3, with their searchlights scanning the ground, eventually following the same trajectory as the Diamond craft heading away toward the Gulf of Mexico.
So we have independent, trained observers verifying the military escort component of the event. The helicopters act as a forensic anchor. They prove that a physical, highly resourced, coordinated operation was taking place in that airspace.
Eventually, the craft and the armada of helicopters recede into the distance. The intense heat dissipates enough for Betty to start the car, and they manage to drive the rest of the way home to Dayton. You'd think that surviving the encounter, getting home, locking the door, you'd think that was the end of the nightmare.
But it was just the beginning.
Yeah.
Because the biological toll of the exposure began to manifest almost immediately. The human body is remarkably resilient, but it has absolute limits when exposed to high-energy fields.
Within hours of returning to Dayton, all 3 of them fall violently ill. We are talking about extreme nausea, relentless vomiting, severe diarrhea, and a burning sensation across their bodies that felt like catastrophic sunburn.
Awful.
Their skin began to erupt in painful, water-filled blisters.
The symptoms are indicative of a massive systemic cellular trauma. To clarify the biophysics here, this is not a localized contact burn.
Right, like touching a hot stove.
Exactly. Where only the skin cells are destroyed by kinetic heat. This is a full-body physiological cascade.
Betty Cash, who was outside the car and had the most direct, unshielded exposure to whatever this thing was, suffered the absolute worst. Over the next few days, her condition deteriorated at a terrifying rate. The blisters on her face and scalp were so severe that her eyes literally swelled shut.
Good Lord.
Her skin was sloughing off. She began losing large clumps of her hair. By January 3rd, just days after the encounter, she was admitted to Parkway Hospital in Houston in a state of near unconsciousness. She couldn't even walk.
The clinical presentation upon her hospital admission is a horrifying endpoint to the chronological timeline. We move from an ordinary drive to an anomalous encounter to a military escort to a catastrophic medical emergency.
It's like imagine accidentally driving your family sedan into the middle of the Chernobyl exclusion zone while a reactor is actively venting. The only analogy I can think of is that this craft acted like a flying blast furnace, or worse, an unshielded nuclear reactor just floating over a civilian highway.
That's a very apt comparison.
The absolute terror of a civilian encountering that kind of raw, destructive energy is hard to overstate.
And that analogy is precisely what makes this case so demanding of an explanation. How do authorities, scientists, and investigators reconcile these three incredibly disparate elements?
Right.
You have a massive flying diamond spewing fire, a deployment of 23 military heavy-lift helicopters, and 3 civilians dying of what appears to be severe radiation sickness.
Right. When you have data this extreme, people are going to scramble to explain it. Human nature abhors a vacuum. And the sources you provided from the investigations break these attempts down into 3 very distinct camps. Let's dig into the first camp, the scientific and mainstream explanations.
Okay, the mainstream approach.
Yeah. These are the theories put forward by those attempting to fit the event entirely within known conventional boundaries, often stripping away the more anomalous claims to make the data behave.
The initial impulse of the mainstream scientific community is always reductionist. So initially, the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, suggested some weather-related explanations. They floated the idea of a hole punch cloud.
Which, if you look at the meteorological data for that night, makes absolutely no sense.
Not at all.
A hole punch cloud is a high-altitude phenomenon involving supercooled water droplets freezing and falling. It doesn't generate heat, it doesn't emit blue lights, and it certainly doesn't require a military escort.
No, the military doesn't scramble 23 Chinooks for a cloud.
When that failed, researchers like Stuart Campbell proposed a highly specific astronomical theory. He suggested that due to a temperature inversion in the atmosphere, the witnesses observed a mirage of the star Canopus, which supposedly lay exactly in line with the road.
The Canopus mirage theory is a classic example of attempting to force astronomical phenomena to fit a terrestrial sighting. Let's look at the physics there.
Yeah, let's.
A temperature inversion, where a layer of warm air traps cooler air near the surface, can indeed bend light and cause optical illusions. It sometimes makes stars appear to shimmer or dance on the horizon. But optical illusions do not generate physical heat capable of melting vinyl.
Exactly.
They do not emit decibels of roaring sound, nor do they cause secondary biological trauma.
Starlight doesn't give you water blisters and make your hair fall out. So when the weather and the stars fail to explain the burns, the skeptical community pivots. And this is where it gets incredibly frustrating and honestly, a bit cruel.
Yeah, the tone definitely shifts here.
They pivot to attacking the witnesses themselves. You have skeptics like Gary Posner, Brian Dunning, and the late Philip J. Klass. Their theories lean heavily into psychological and medical skepticism.
They propose explanations ranging from mass psychogenic illness, essentially a shared delusion or hysteria that manifests physical symptoms, to Munchausen syndrome.
Yeah, the Munchausen theory is particularly dark. It suggests that Betty Cash was deliberately faking her illness and actively self-inflicting her own burns to gain attention or financial compensation.
Which is a massive accusation.
Posner, a medical doctor who analyzed the photos, pointed out that some of the burn patterns on Betty's arms were distinctly round. He argued that doesn't perfectly match typical ambient radiation exposure, but rather looks like something pressed against the skin. Furthermore, they suggested her hair loss could be attributed to an autoimmune disease called alopecia areata, rather than radiation.
What's fascinating here is the sheer volume of coincidence you have to accept to believe these mainstream skeptical theories. To accept the Munchausen and alopecia theory, you have to believe that Betty Cash miraculously developed a rare autoimmune disease the exact same night she decided to systematically burn herself and poison her friends.
It's ridiculous.
And you have to believe she convinced a 7-year-old boy to play along for the rest of his life.
It's absurd. The mental gymnastics are exhausting. Did Lamar Walker, the police officer 15 miles away, hallucinate 12 Chinook helicopters because he also had Munchausen syndrome?
Exactly.
And what about the melted dashboard? Did Betty sneak back out to her own car in the middle of the night with a blowtorch to fake the evidence, all while her eyes were swollen shut? The mainstream skeptical theories just collapse under the weight of the physical logistics. You cannot psychoanalyze a melted dashboard.
Precisely. Which naturally leads serious investigators to the second camp of theories, the forensic and physical theories. We can call this the Ayers category.
The hours category, okay.
This approach accepts the physical evidence, the heat, the illness, the helicopters as factual, and concludes that the craft was a highly classified, tangible machine built by the United States government.
This is actually the most supported theory among the serious aerospace engineers and investigators who work the case. They posit that this diamond object was an experimental U.S. vehicle utilizing classified nuclear propulsion, and the sources point to some very specific, terrifying Cold War projects to back this up.
The most prominent historical comparison is to Project Pluto. Project Pluto was a real deeply classified program in the late 1950s and 60s designed to build a nuclear-powered ramjet cruise missile.
Oh, wow.
It was often referred to as the SLAM, or Supersonic Low-Altitude Missile.
Let's break down the mechanics of the SLAM, because it is exactly what you'd expect from a Cold War doomsday weapon. A traditional jet engine burns chemical fuel to heat air and create thrust.
Right, fairly standard.
But a nuclear ramjet doesn't use chemical fuel. Instead, air is scooped into the front of the craft, passes directly over a white-hot, unshielded nuclear reactor core, expands violently due to the extreme heat, and shoots out the back.
And that's where the danger lies.
Exactly. It was designed to fly at incredibly low altitudes, at Mach 3, and because the nuclear reactor was essentially unshielded to save weight, the engine would spew highly radioactive fission fragments directly into its own exhaust wake.
It was a flying dirty bomb.
Yes, it was designed to literally irradiate the terrain it flew over, killing everything beneath it, even before it dropped its payload.
The mechanical parallel to the Cash Landrum craft is striking. A low-flying, unshielded nuclear thermal rocket exhibiting a catastrophic containment failure would perfectly explain the periodic downward blasts of roaring flames.
Yeah, that's sputtering.
Exactly. It would explain the immense thermal radiation cooking the car. And it would explain the subsequent severe illness of anyone caught in its exhaust plume.
There was also a whistleblower mentioned in the sources who claimed the craft was something called a WASP-P2, a nuclear-powered personnel carrier designed for hostage rescue operations, which suffered a massive malfunction.
Interesting.
And here's why the Ars theory makes so much sense. If it was an experimental U.S. nuclear asset, it perfectly explains why 23 military helicopters were instantly on the scene.
They were the cleanup crew.
They weren't there by accident. They were the emergency retrieval and containment team scrambling to escort a failing, highly dangerous nuclear weapon away from population centers and toward the safety of the Gulf of Mexico.
It is a logically sound framework. However, the sheer bizarre geometry of the craft, a massive flat-topped diamond, and the extreme level of government denial opens the door to the third camp, the speculative and fringe theories.
The not ours category.
Exactly. This is the not ours category.
Oh boy. Okay, let's go there. This is where we get into the extraterrestrial crash retrieval theories. Figures in the ufology space, like Dr. Stephen Greer and a controversial former Air Force intelligence officer named Richard Doty, have pushed the narrative that the diamond craft was actually of non-human origin.
But with a very specific terrestrial twist, they do not argue that E.T. was driving a diamond ship over Texas.
Right. The theory claims that the military had captured an alien craft perhaps decades prior, but couldn't figure out its propulsion system. The anti-gravity wasn't working.
So human engineering takes over.
Yeah. So what do human engineers do? They rip out the alien engine and essentially retrofit the hull with a human-made, reverse-engineered nuclear reactor.
A Frankenstein hybrid.
Exactly. And what Betty, Vicky, and Colby saw was this Frankenstein hybrid test flight going catastrophically wrong. The human nuclear core was failing, causing the flames and the radiation leaks, while the military desperately tried to escort their prize back to base.
It's a theory that attempts to marry the undeniable presence of human military logistics, the Boeing helicopters, with the radically unconventional geometry of the craft itself.
And if you want to go even deeper into the black budget lore, there's a source referred to as McGarity, tied to House Oversight Committee testimony, who claimed the object was a highly classified project known as Senior Soda.
Senior Soda.
Yeah. According to this claim, it was a specialized ramjet disc that had been tracked flying all the way out from the Nevada test site, losing altitude and failing over Texas.
So we have three distinct frameworks: the skeptical dismissal of the witnesses, the terrestrial nuclear accident, and the hybrid prototype.
Right.
But frameworks and theories are just that, ideas. To determine which, if any, holds water, we must move past the speculation and examine the hard technical explanations. We have the medical data, we have the environmental data. Do they actually match up when subjected to rigorous scientific scrutiny?
Let's start with where the technical analysis actually succeeded, the biophysical analysis. Because while skeptics tried to hand-wave the illness as psychological, the medical professionals treating these women were looking at very real, Very terrifying blood work and tissue damage.
We must highlight the clinical findings of Dr. Brian McClellan, Betty Cash's primary physician. After extensive evaluation, Dr. McClellan stated publicly that her symptoms were not psychosomatic,
Right.
nor were they standard thermal burns from a localized heat source. He declared it a textbook case of acute radiation syndrome, or ARS.
He didn't mince words either. He compared her physiological damage directly to the victims of the atomic bombing at Hiroshima. He estimated she absorbed between 1 and 2 grays of ionizing radiation.
Which is a significant dose.
For context, that is not enough to be immediately lethal, but it is more than enough to cause catastrophic cellular damage.
Let's explain the biology of that. Ionizing radiation like gamma rays or neutron radiation doesn't just heat tissue. It carries so much energy that it literally knocks electrons off of atoms.
It changes you on a molecular level.
Yes. When these high-energy photons tear through the human body, they shatter the DNA strands within the cells. The cells that are most vulnerable are the ones that divide rapidly: hair follicles, the lining of the stomach and intestines, and skin cells.
Which perfectly maps to the sudden alopecia, the severe gastrointestinal distress, and the blistering that all 3 witnesses experienced.
Exactly. And this diagnosis is deeply corroborated by a fascinating piece of intelligence literature that you, the learner, included in the sources. We have a Defense Intelligence Reference Document, a DRRD, authored by a scientist named James Lakatsky.
The Lakatsky DRRD. This document is wild.
It really is. This document was part of a later, deeply classified Pentagon program studying anomalous aerospace threats. This DRD is incredible because it explicitly uses the Cash Landrum incident as a benchmark case study for biological injuries caused by advanced aerospace systems.
He doesn't guess. He provides a highly technical, dual-layered explanation for what happened to the women. He states that the victims were exposed to a complex electromagnetic assault.
Right, a dual-layered exposure.
The first layer of exposure, according to the DIRD, was broadband ultra-high radio frequency or microwave radiation, specifically operating in the 1 to 10 gigahertz range at a power density of over 100 milliwatts per square centimeter.
Let's translate the physics of that. Microwave radiation at that intensity acts exactly like the appliance in your kitchen. It interacts with polar molecules, primarily water, causing them to vibrate rapidly, which generates extreme heat through friction.
This perfectly explains the immediate sensory overload. The instantaneous feeling of burning from the inside out, the blistering of the skin, the extreme heat of the metal car, and the melting of the vinyl dashboard.
It cooked the environment.
Literally. The microwave RF energy vibrated the water in the mud and the polymers in the dashboard.
But microwave radiation is non-ionizing. It heats tissue, but it lacks the energy to shatter DNA strands. Therefore, Lakatsky concludes there had to be a second component.
A massive emission of ionizing radiation.
Yes, the gamma rays or neutron radiation we discussed, which penetrated deeper into their bodies, causing the deeper cellular dyscrasia, the internal destruction, and the DNA damage that Dr. McClellan diagnosed.
So the biophysical analysis is a massive success for the classified nuclear prototype theory. The medical data perfectly aligns with an unshielded nuclear thermal engine leaking both microwave and ionizing radiation.
It fits like a glove.
But here is where I have to push back, and this is the critical, glaring question that breaks the whole case wide open. If this thing was spewing Hiroshima levels of ionizing nuclear fallout into its exhaust plume, wait, why wasn't the entire forest totally irradiated?
And that is the fatal flaw in the radiation theory. It brings us to the environmental contradiction. In 1981, following the incident, investigators from the Texas Department of Health traveled to the exact site on FM 1485.
To test the area.
They swept the area, the soil, the trees, with highly sensitive Geiger counters.
So they take Geiger counters out to the mud on FM 1485, expecting it to be a miniature Chernobyl. And I'm looking at the Texas Department of Health report right here, and it's a complete blank.
The thing.
0 residual ionizing radiation. No abnormal isotopes. Nothing. Which makes absolutely no sense if we're assuming this was an unshielded nuclear rocket. If it was a dirty reactor like the SLAM project, it should have left a radioactive footprint in the soil, strontium, cesium, that would be detectable for years, if not decades.
Furthermore, aerospace investigator Brad Sparks analyzed the timeline of the symptoms and pointed out a glaring biophysical contradiction. He noted that if the women had received a dose of ionizing radiation massive enough to induce immediate, violent vomiting and blistering within just 6 hours, that specific high-level dose would have been 100% lethal within a matter of days.
But they survived.
Yes. Yet while severely disabled, all three witnesses lived for years, and in Colby's case, decades after the event.
So the technical explanation fails to perfectly align with the physical environment. We have symptoms of a massive ionizing dose, but a survival timeline and a clean environmental sweep that directly contradicts it.
It's a paradox.
We have the biological damage of a nuclear bomb, but no residual radiation.
And that paradox extends from the microscopic cellular level all the way up to the macro level of military logistics. We must examine the logistical and aviation investigation, which is perhaps the most glaring failure of official accountability in this entire case.
Right, because let's go back to the helicopters. You can't just hide 23 massive Chinooks. Due to the public outcry, the media attention, and the involvement of Texas senators who were demanding answers for their constituents, the military was forced to conduct an investigation.
They had to respond.
Yeah. This was led by Lieutenant Colonel George Sarin of the Department of the Army Inspector General. His mission was simple: track down the 23 CH-47 Chinooks, check the flight logs, find the pilots.
He queried Fort Hood, Ellington Air Force Base, and other regional installations. He looked at radar data, and his official conclusion was absolute.
What did he find?
He found zero evidence that any United States Armed Forces helicopters were operating in that area on the night of December 29, 1980.
Which is a logistical absurdity. I said it before. It's like hiding a parade.
It truly is. 23 heavy-lift military helicopters represent a massive, unavoidable footprint. We are talking about coordinated flight plans, air traffic control tracking, radar signatures across multiple civilian and military sectors, and the immense fuel expenditures that have to be logged and accounted for.
You don't just quietly scramble 23 Chinooks over a civilian populace on a Monday night, shine searchlights into people's living rooms, and leave no paperwork.
No, you don't.
As the investigators pointed out, an operation of that magnitude cannot simply vanish from the administrative record. The only way they don't exist on paper is if there is deliberate systemic obfuscation happening at the highest levels of the command structure. Someone, somewhere, ordered those logs to be shredded or classified.
Which logically forces us to look at what data is actively missing. Because if the military officially declares that the operation never happened and the environmental radiation mysteriously vanished, we're no longer just looking at what the data says.
Right.
We have to look at the shadows. We have to identify the information gaps where data was actively removed, suppressed, or contradicted.
And there are some massive glaring holes in this story. Let's start with the road itself. Because remember, the Texas Department of Health found no radiation. But what about physical thermal damage to the asphalt?
7 weeks after the incident, John Schuessler, an aerospace engineer who became one of the primary civilian investigators on this case, visited the site on FM 1485, and he found exactly what you would expect from a hovering thermal anomaly.
He found a massive patch of charred, scorched, and cracked asphalt exactly where Betty Cash had parked her car. It was the physical burn scar of the event.
A tangible trace.
It proved something insanely hot had been hovering right there, matching perfectly with the melted dashboard and the blistered skin.
But the evidentiary value of that scar was incredibly short-lived.
Yeah. Shortly after Schuessler's visit, local residents reported seeing unmarked construction trucks arriving at the site in the dead of night.
In the dead of night.
Under the cover of darkness, crews dug up that specific scorched section of the road, hauled the damaged asphalt away, and replaced it with fresh pavement. The primary physical forensic site was deliberately and actively destroyed.
The removal of the road surface suggests a highly managed cleanup operation. You do not deploy nighttime, unmarked road crews for standard county pothole maintenance.
No, you don't.
It implies a targeted erasure of the thermal and potentially chemical or exotic evidence left behind by the craft's exhaust.
And the erasure didn't stop with the asphalt. It extended to the medical data.
We discussed Dr. McClellan's diagnosis of acute radiation syndrome. To solidify this diagnosis and perhaps understand the exact exotic nature of the radiation that caused biological damage without leaving environmental residue, he needed Betty Cash's initial emergency room records.
Right, the raw blood work data from her first admission to Parkway Hospital.
Exactly. So, as her primary physician, he requests them. Standard procedure. He sends the medical release forms, and nothing. Crickets.
They just ignored him.
Over the years, he stated that he sent between 20 to 30 legal release forms to Parkway Hospital to get those files. Every single one was entirely ignored. Dr. McClellan ultimately concluded that the records had been actively blocked by what he called military or legal means.
Keep in mind this was before the strict HIPAA laws we have today. The suppression of civilians' medical records by an external authority was a profound violation of protocol.
It heavily suggests that the initial blood work contained anomalous isotope signatures or cellular damage markers that the government could not allow into the public domain.
Like a smoking gun.
If the blood work showed exposure to a specific classified nuclear isotope, that would be proof of a U.S. black project.
Which leads us to a piece of evidence that might be the weirdest, most frustrating piece of this entire puzzle. The bizarre Dayton helicopter landing.
This incident provides a fleeting, tantalizing glimpse into the human element operating those mysterious helicopters. It breaks the wall of anonymity.
It's April 1981, a few months after the incident. A CH-47 Chinook helicopter actually flies into the town of Dayton and lands in a public area.
Right in town.
Now remember Colby, the 7-year-old? He has developed severe PTSD and a terrifying phobia of helicopters since that night. So his grandmother, Vicky, decides on some grassroots exposure therapy. She takes Colby down to the landing zone to see the helicopter up close, hoping to show him that the men inside are just regular soldiers, not the apocalyptic monsters he remembers.
They wait their turn, and eventually they are allowed inside the Chinook to speak with the pilot.
And this is where the script flips. According to Vicky and another visitor who was present, they're chatting with the pilot, who was later identified in military reports as Chief Warrant Officer 3 Culberson. During the small talk, Culberson casually mentions that he's familiar with the area because he had been deployed out here before to check on a UFO in trouble near Huffman.
He essentially admits to participating in the December 29th retrieval operation, a slip of the tongue by an overconfident pilot.
Right. So Vicky, hearing this, gets excited. She says, "Oh, I'm so glad to see you. We were the ones in the car. I'm one of the people burned by that UFO."
And the pilot's demeanor instantly changes.
Instantly. The friendly PR tour is over. He abruptly hushes them, refuses to say another word, and physically hustles them out of the aircraft. Later, when investigator Lieutenant Colonel Sarin pressed CW3 Culberson about this exact conversation during the official military inquiry, Culberson flatly refused to speak,
Invoking national security as his reason for silence.
The invocation of national security by the pilot is the closest thing to an official confirmation we have. It transforms his silence from a simple denial into a classified mandate. He isn't saying it didn't happen. He is legally bound from discussing that it did happen.
Which brings us to the conspiracy layers and the alleged cover-ups. Because if you have physical evidence being dug up from the road, medical records being locked away, and pilots hiding behind national security, you are no longer dealing with a mystery. You are dealing with a systemic cover-up.
And the most impenetrable layer of that cover-up was constructed not in the shadows, but right out in the open through the American judicial system.
We must examine the legal trap known as the public vessel defense.
Right. So Betty and Vicky, facing mounting astronomical medical bills and rapidly deteriorating health, decide to fight back. In 1982, with the help of attorney Peter Gersten taking the case pro bono, they file a $20 million lawsuit against the United States government. The case is Cash v. United States, filed under the Federal Tort Claims Act.
The premise of their lawsuit was straightforward and logically sound. They were severely injured by a piece of hardware and a fleet of helicopters operated by the U.S. military. Therefore, the government is liable for their medical damages.
But the government's legal defense was a masterpiece of circular bureaucratic absurdity. Okay, follow this logic carefully because it is maddeningly brilliant. The government invoked sovereign immunity, arguing in court that under the law, they cannot be sued unless the plaintiffs, Betty and Vicky, can conclusively prove that the Diamond craft and the helicopters belong to the U.S. Armed Forces.
Which, in a normal civil suit involving, say, a postal truck hitting your car, is a standard burden of proof. You produce the license plate, you prove ownership.
Except, because the craft, if it existed, was a highly classified black project, the government officially refused to acknowledge its existence. They simply stated, "We have no record of this craft or these helicopters." And because the government denied owning it and actively suppressed the logs, Betty and Vicky couldn't legally prove that the government owned it.
It is the ultimate catch-22 of classified litigation. To win compensation for their radiation burns, the victims had to present classified documentation that the government was simultaneously withholding from them under the guise of national security.
It's infuriating.
Because they could not produce the classified proof of ownership, the judge was legally bound to rule that the government was not at fault. The burden of proof was rendered structurally impossible to meet. In 1986, the judge dismissed the case.
So what does this all mean? It means the government successfully used its own secrecy classification to shield itself from liability for injuring its own citizens. It's a legally sanctioned dead end. The law worked exactly as it was designed to protect the state.
And while the legal battle was shutting doors in the courtroom, there was allegedly a quieter, more intimidating campaign happening on the ground in East Texas.
Yeah, the secondary intimidation. Remember Lamar Walker, the police officer, and the other locals who saw the helicopters? Investigative reports from the time suggest that the Dayton and New Caney areas were visited by men in suits.
The classic Men in Black archetype.
Exactly. These unidentified individuals were approaching local motorists and residents who had been in the area that night, advising them in no uncertain terms that the helicopter activity was a matter of national security and warning them not to speak publicly about what they saw.
This type of localized intimidation creates an atmosphere of fear, effectively chilling the witness pool and ensuring that no new corroborating data enters the public record.
But the government wasn't the only entity muddying the waters. We also have to talk about the ufology infighting, because the civilian researchers investigating this case ended up cannibalizing each other.
The drama within the civilian investigative community often derails the scientific process, and the Cash Landrum case is a prime example of ego-destroying inquiry. You have a bitter rivalry between two prominent organizations. APRO, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization led by Coral Lorenzen, and MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, whose investigation was spearheaded by John Schuessler.
It got incredibly nasty. Coral Lorenzen actually published articles in the APRO Bulletin accusing Schuessler and even the legendary UFO researcher Dr. J. Allen Hynek of being part of a government cover-up themselves. She insinuated that because Schuessler had ties to NASA and Hynek had consulted for Project Blue Book, they were actively suppressing the truth about the Cash Landrum craft being a U.S. experimental vehicle to protect their government buddies.
It is important to note that the sources are highly conflicting here. Lorenzen's camp was certain this was a coordinated cover-up by Schuessler, while MUFON's defenders viewed it as a baseless character assassination.
And honestly, it doesn't matter who started it or who was right. The objective result was a disaster for the investigation. Instead of pooling their resources, sharing data, and presenting a united front to help these dying women, the civilian researchers spent their energy writing hit pieces about each other.
It fractured the investigation and destroyed any momentum they had in the court of public opinion.
Which leaves us to face the ultimate tragedy of this deep dive, the human toll.
Where does this all leave us today? Officially, the Cash Landrum incident remains officially unsolved. It is an active cold case anomaly. The stance of the United States government remains exactly what it was in 1981. A blanket, unwavering denial that any operation, military or otherwise, took place on FM 1485 that night.
But while the bureaucratic status remains frozen, the biological reality of the victims continued to degrade.
Colby Landrum, who was just a 7-year-old boy that night, lived with severe psychological trauma. He developed a paralyzing fear of helicopters, needed glasses due to vision degradation, and carried the raised scars from those blisters for the rest of his life.
And
Vicki Landrum battled chronic immune system issues and severe cataracts, fighting for answers until she passed away in September 2007 at the age of 83.
But the most chilling fate belongs to Betty Cash, the woman who stepped out of the car and faced the unshielded heat of the anomaly. Betty's life after the encounter was a relentless medical nightmare. She battled multiple types of cancer, debilitating weakness, and constant health crises.
She fought through the pain and the lawsuits and the government denials until her body finally gave out.
Yeah. Betty Cash passed away on December 29, 1998.
Exactly 18 years, to the very day after she encountered the diamond craft on that dark road in the piney woods.
It's a haunting detail, and it forces me to end this deep dive with a final provocative thought. Throughout this entire investigation, we and the civilian investigators and the doctors have operated on a single core assumption. The craft was broken. We assumed that the roaring flames, the microwave radiation, and the military escort meant that the vehicle was experiencing a catastrophic malfunction.
A reasonable assumption when faced with such destructive output and erratic flight patterns.
But what if we were wrong? What if it wasn't broken? Look at the SLAM project, the nuclear ramjet we discussed. It was designed to spew radiation. It was designed to fly low and hot. What if the massive expulsion of radioactive microwave-emitting exhaust wasn't a malfunction at all, but the actual intended byproduct of a successful new propulsion system?
If that hypothesis is correct, It represents a terrifying paradigm shift in how we view the event.
If that craft was operating exactly as designed, it means that the United States military was knowingly, intentionally test flying an unshielded radiological weapon directly over civilian highways. It means they looked at the potential for irradiating their own citizens, melting their cars, and destroying their health, and simply accepted that collateral damage as the necessary cost of winning the Cold War.
It changes the narrative from an accidental tragedy to a calculated sacrifice.
It forces us to ask what the state is willing to do to its own people under the impenetrable shield of national security. Which brings us right back to that broken X-ray machine we talked about at the beginning. We want the clean white line. We want to be able to point to the anomaly and say, there is the broken bone, there is the malfunction.
But in the murky, classified waters of the Cash Landrum incident, the machine isn't just broken. It's actively hiding the diagnosis.
To you, the learner, thank you. Thank you for submitting this incredibly dense, challenging, and important stack of sources. Keep digging into the dark corners of history. Keep questioning the official assumptions, and above all, stay insanely curious.